Under a pale moon, the Roman banners fluttered quietly above Vallis Nox, a city thought loyal to the empire. But loyalty is a fragile thing. In one single night, its gates swung open from within, and 10,000 Roman soldiers were butchered in their sleep. Their screams were swallowed by the mist, their blood painting the cobblestones red. This was not a battle, it was a massacre. From the ashes of betrayal, a single wounded general would rise, vowing vengeance so fierce that even the gods would take notice. Stay with us as we journey through betrayal, blood, and vengeance, where Rome's glory teetered on the edge of ruin, and a single man's fury would ignite a legend. This is the untold story of Vallis Nox, and the night Rome almost fell. The winter of 18 AD had cast a pall over the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Frost clung stubbornly to the pines, and the valleys echoed with the cries of wolves that prowled the darkness. Yet within the fortified city of Vallis Nox, all was calm, or so it seemed. Roman sentries, wrapped in heavy cloaks, patrolled the battlements, their breath misting in the frigid air. Inside the gates, 10,000 legionaries rested, confident in their safety, convinced that Vallis Nox was a loyal ally of Rome. This was not a land of strangers. Rome had spent years forging alliances with the tribes of the frontier, offering gold and protection in exchange for loyalty. Vallis Nox had been a prized jewel of this network, a city of towering walls and ancient watchtowers, its chieftains swearing fealty beneath the imperial eagle. The Romans had no reason to suspect betrayal. Their officers drank warm wine with the local leaders. Their scouts roamed freely through the snow-choked passes. No alarm sounded, no whispers of danger carried on the wind. But on that fateful night, beneath a pale and shifting moon, treachery stirred like a venomous serpent. The leaders of Vallis Nox, once sworn to Rome, had been seduced by promises whispered in the shadows, promises of freedom, of vengeance, and of power. Agnar, the warlord known as the Wolf of the North, had united the tribes under a single banner, and Vallis Nox was his crowning triumph. With a traitor's smile, the city's gates were unbarred in the dead of night, and Agnar's warriors, silent as shades, slipped into the Roman camp. What followed was not war. It was slaughter. The first to die were the sentries, their throats slit before they could cry out. Then came the tents. Warriors crept through the rows of sleeping legionaries, cutting them down as they lay. Torches were lit, and the camp erupted in chaos. Flames devoured canvas and wood, and the night sky turned red as blood. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the screams of men awakening to their deaths. The disciplined ranks of Rome, veterans of campaigns in Germania and Gaul, were reduced to terrified fugitives, stumbling through fire and smoke, their training useless in the face of treachery. The streets of Vallis Nox became rivers of crimson. Soldiers rushed to the gates only to find them barred. Trapped like prey in a hunter's snare, they fought desperately in narrow alleys, the clash of steel drowned out by the war cries of their betrayers. Agnar himself strode through the carnage, his wolfskin cloak snapping in the wind, his axe cleaving through Roman shields. He was not merely a warrior, he was a shadow of fear incarnate. By dawn, the massacre was complete. 10,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. The banners of the empire, once a symbol of invincibility, were trampled into the blood-soaked mud. The surviving few were hunted through the snow-covered hills, their bodies left to rot as a warning to all who would trust the might of Rome. Among the carnage, a young general named Flavius Cassian lay half-conscious, his armor dented, his side pierced by an enemy spear. But fate had not yet claimed him. He awoke beneath a shattered palisade, surrounded by the corpses of his men, and through sheer force of will, rallied a band of 300 survivors. With grit and determination, they carved a path through enemy lines, slipping away into the frozen wilderness. Behind them, Vallis Nox burned, and the empire's pride burned with it. That night, a message spread faster than any legion could march. Rome had been betrayed. A city once trusted had turned its back, and an entire legion had been wiped out in the span of a single night. The illusion of Roman invincibility shattered like glass beneath a hammer, and as Cassian limped toward the safety of a distant fortress, his heart was not filled with despair. It was filled with something far more dangerous, a cold and unyielding vow. Vallis Nox would pay. The wolf of the north would bleed, and Rome would rise again, not with treaties or gold, but with fire and vengeance. The tragedy of Vallis Nox was more than a massacre. It was the spark that would ignite a war of shadows, a conflict that would etch Cassian's name into legend. But for now, all Rome knew was loss. The survivors of Vallis Nox staggered through the snow like specters, their armor battered, their spirits crushed. The once proud eagle standards of Rome were nowhere to be seen, only ragged banners torn by wind and blood. At their head rode Flavius Cassian, the youngest general ever appointed to command a legion on the northern frontier. Barely 27, Cassian had earned his rank through brilliance in battle, not noble birth. His piercing gray eyes, once bright with ambition, now carried a haunted fire. Cassian's journey to this moment was not one of privilege, but of grit. He was born to a modest family in Campania, the son of a minor merchant who had traded olive oil and wine. When Cassian was 12, his village was raided by bandits, and his father was killed before his eyes. Orphaned and hardened, Cassian fled to Rome, where he joined the legions as a common soldier. His rise through the ranks was meteoric. By the age of 20, he had commanded a century. By 24, he had the ear of generals. His instincts were razor sharp, his courage unmatched, and his loyalty to Rome unshakable. Yet no amount of skill or courage could have prepared him for Vallis Nox. The betrayal had cut deeper than any wound, and the screams of his dying men echoed in his mind with every step he took through the frozen wilderness. Of the 10,000 soldiers entrusted to him, only 300 remained, and they were broken, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Cassian knew that survival alone would not be enough. These men needed purpose. They needed hope. And so, even as blood seeped from the wound in his side, he forced himself to walk among them, offering words of steel. "Look at me," he said to one soldier who wept over the body of a fallen comrade. "You are alive because Rome demands it. Your brothers died so you could fight again. Will you let their sacrifice rot in the snow?" The soldier's trembling ceased, and he clenched his fist. Cassian moved on, his voice carrying over the bitter wind. "We are not broken," he declared to the survivors, huddled around a dying fire. "We are forged. Betrayal cuts deep, but steel is made in fire. We will heal. We will grow strong. And when we return to Vallis Nox, they will remember our faces in terror." It was in that moment that Cassian ceased to be a mere commander. He became a symbol. The men began calling him the Iron Hawk for his relentless gaze and his refusal to bow under defeat. The name spread quickly through the ranks, carrying with it a flicker of hope that even the bitter cold could not extinguish. The journey back to Roman territory took weeks. The survivors marched through snowdrifts and forests haunted by enemy scouts. Food was scarce, wounds festered, frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Yet every dawn, Cassian stood at the head of the column, spear in hand, his cloak stiff with ice. He carried no shield, not out of arrogance, but as a statement. He would not hide from death. One night, as the men huddled near a smoldering fire, a scout rushed into the camp. "They're hunting us," the man panted, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Agnar's raiders. They're closing in." Cassian's face hardened. He ordered the men to form a defensive circle, shields raised, spears outward. The snowstorm howled around them, muffling sound, but the glow of enemy torches flickered in the distance. "They think we are prey," Cassian said, his voice calm and steady. "Let us remind them we are Romans." The ensuing skirmish was brutal. Enemy warriors lunged through the storm, their axes gleaming, but the survivors held firm. Cassian fought like a man possessed, cutting through foes with precision, his movements fueled by rage and duty. When dawn broke, the snow was stained red, and the raiders had fled, leaving behind dozens of dead. That battle marked a turning point. The men began to see Cassian as more than a commander. He was a beacon of vengeance, a man chosen by the gods to avenge their fallen brothers. Songs were whispered by the campfires about the Iron Hawk, who defied death in the shadow of betrayal. When they finally reached the safety of a Roman fortress, word of their survival spread like wildfire. Messengers carried tales of Vallis Nox to Rome, and senators gasped at the scale of the disaster. But the name that stood out in every report was Flavius Cassian, the young general who had refused to die, who had led his men through enemy-infested mountains with a spear in hand and fury in his heart. Cassian was summoned to Rome to give an account of the massacre. He stood before the Senate, his armor still scarred from battle, his body stiff with lingering pain. The senators whispered among themselves, expecting to see a broken man. Instead, they found a soldier whose voice cut through the chamber like steel. "Vallis Nox will burn," Cassian vowed, his gray eyes cold. "For every Roman soldier left to rot in the snow, 100 of theirs will fall. Give me the men, the weapons, and the freedom to strike, and I will not just avenge this betrayal, I will make it a legend." The Senate, shaken by the massacre and impressed by his resolve, granted Cassian full command of a new campaign. But Cassian did not request legions in the traditional sense. He sought volunteers, men who had lost everything to Agnar's treachery, men with nothing left but rage. From across the empire, soldiers came forward, swearing oaths to follow him into the jaws of death. And so a new brotherhood was born, a shadow army forged not in the parade grounds of Rome, but in the blood-soaked snows of Vallis Nox. They would become hunters, not soldiers, striking in silence, moving unseen, and killing without mercy. At their head stood Cassian, his once youthful face now carved by grief and determination. He had risen from the ashes of betrayal, not as a survivor, but as a weapon. Vallis Nox had created a monster Rome would unleash upon its enemies. News of the massacre at Vallis Nox traveled faster than any legion could march. Merchants whispered of it along the Appian Way, their words heavy with fear. Messengers galloped through snow and mud, bearing sealed scrolls that told of betrayal and slaughter. By the time the tidings reached Rome, the entire city trembled with outrage. Senators gathered in hurried assemblies, the marble halls of the Curia echoing with furious debate. The death of 10,000 Roman soldiers in a single night was not merely a military disaster. It was a blow to the very heart of the empire's power and pride. In the Forum, crowds assembled, their voices rising in anger. Citizens cried for vengeance, their fists raised toward the Senate House. "Blood for blood," they chanted. "Vallis Nox must burn." The people of Rome, accustomed to tales of Roman invincibility, now faced a grim reality. The empire was not untouchable. Foreign tribes had not only defied Rome, but humiliated it. Inside the Curia, chaos reigned. Some senators demanded an immediate punitive expedition, calling for the mobilization of 3 full legions to sweep across the frontier and raze Vallis Nox to the ground. Others counseled caution, their voices trembling with fear. "We do not know how many tribes have joined Agnar," warned Senator Gallius, an old man whose trembling hands clutched a scroll of intelligence reports. If Vallis Nox is but one city in a greater confederation, marching blindly into the north would be folly. Accusations flew like arrows. Some blamed the generals on the frontier for negligence. Others accused the Senate itself of weakness, claiming that years of appeasement and gold had made Rome soft. The emperor, still young and untested, was caught between factions, hawks demanding retribution and doves urging diplomacy. But for all their speeches and debates, none could ignore the growing unrest beyond the city walls. In every marketplace, whispers spread that the gods had abandoned Rome. Mothers wept for sons lost in a land of snow and treachery. Veterans, their faces scarred by campaigns past, shook their heads in grim silence, knowing what a defeat like this meant. Rome's enemies would smell blood. Rebellion could spark across the provinces like wildfire. Far to the north, on the empire's frontier, the ripples of Vallis Nox's betrayal turned into waves of panic. Allied tribes who once pledged loyalty to Rome now hesitated, questioning the empire's strength. Roman garrisons fortified their walls, expecting raids. Traders abandoned routes through the mountains, fearful of ambushes. The once unshakable Pax Romana seemed to falter. In the fortress where Flavius Cassian and his surviving 300 men recuperated, grim reality set in. Cassian watched from the ramparts as couriers came and went, their faces pale, their scrolls sealed with the wax of urgent orders. He knew Rome's political machine well enough to see the signs: hesitation, fear, paralysis. The Senate would debate vengeance while Vallis Nox grew stronger. Every day lost was a gift to Agnar and his confederation. Cassian spent his days drilling the survivors, turning them from wounded men into hardened warriors. Each night, however, he met with his officers and scouts, poring over crude maps of the northern valleys. He traced enemy routes with his finger, memorizing every mountain pass, every river ford. Though Rome debated, Cassian prepared for war. Back in the capital, senatorial intrigue deepened. Some saw the massacre as an opportunity to discredit political rivals. Others sought to exploit fear to push for new military reforms, demanding greater funding for frontier defenses. But in their maneuverings, one truth became clear. Vallis Nox had become a symbol, not just of betrayal, but of Roman weakness, and symbols had power. The emperor, pressured by the Senate and enraged by the scale of the loss, called for a public ceremony to honor the fallen. In the forum, thousands gathered as a line of 10,000 empty helmets was displayed on marble steps, each one representing a dead legionary. Women wept openly, men clenched their fists. When the emperor spoke, his words rang with fury. Rome bleeds tonight, but Rome will not forget. Let the name Vallis Nox be cursed. Let their betrayal be etched into stone. And let every enemy know this. The blood of Romans cries for vengeance, and vengeance will come. The speech stirred the masses, but Cassian, standing in the crowd with his cloak pulled over his face, knew that speeches alone would not reclaim the frontier. Rome was a giant wounded, its enemies circling like wolves. To strike back, the empire would need not just armies, but a new kind of warfare. In the days that followed, Cassian was summoned to a private council with the emperor and key generals. The chamber was dimly lit, its walls lined with maps of provinces stretching from Hispania to the deserts of Arabia. Cassian stood before them, still bearing the scars of his escape. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of steel. Vallis Nox was not merely a battle lost, he said. It was a war declared. Agnar has united the northern tribes. He will not stop at the mountains. If Rome hesitates, we will see rebellion spread from Gaul to Germania. We must act, but not with legions marching in formation. He expects that. He is prepared. What he will not expect is fear. The generals exchanged uneasy glances, but the emperor leaned forward intrigued. Fear? Cassian nodded. We will not meet him as an army. We will meet him as a shadow. Strike his supply lines, destroy his alliances, make his warriors fear the dark. For every Roman life taken, we will take 100 silently. Vallis Nox will fall before they even know war has begun. The emperor's gaze hardened, but a glimmer of approval flickered in his eyes. Rome had been humiliated, but now it would fight back, not with brute force, but with cunning. And at the heart of this new campaign would be Cassian, the Iron Hawk, whose name was already whispered in fearful tones among the frontier tribes. Rome was wounded, but in that wound, a fire had been lit. The massacre had shaken the empire to its core, but from that chaos, a new kind of war would be born. Far to the north, beyond Rome's fortified frontiers, the snowbound valleys and towering pines whispered the name Agnar, the Wolf of the North. To his people, he was not merely a warlord, he was a living legend. Among the tribes, they told tales of his birth beneath a blood moon, of how wolves circled his cradle without harming him, and of how his first kill came at the age of 12, when he slew a raider twice his size. Whether these stories were truth or myth mattered little. They fed the growing belief that Agnar was chosen by the gods of the wild. Unlike Rome's generals, trained in academies and hardened through organized campaigns, Agnar had grown up in the unforgiving north, where survival demanded cunning as much as strength. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, turning forests and mountains into weapons. His warriors, bound by blood oaths rather than formal rank, were ghosts in the snow, capable of vanishing into the mist and striking again when least expected. But what made Agnar truly dangerous was not just his skill in war, it was his ability to unite the fractured northern tribes. For centuries, these clans had been bitter rivals, their feuds older than Rome itself. Yet Agnar, with his sharp tongue and iron will, forged them into a single confederation under his banner. He offered them more than plunder. He offered them vengeance. Rome had claimed their lands, burned their villages, and enslaved their kin. Under Agnar's leadership, the tribes found a cause worth dying for. The betrayal at Vallis Nox had been Agnar's masterpiece. He had courted the city's leaders in secret, speaking to them not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Rome, he argued, had turned Vallis Nox into a puppet, stripping it of its independence. He promised them freedom, riches, and a place of honor in the new order he envisioned. The city's chieftains, tempted by gold and glory, betrayed their oaths to Rome. Agnar's warriors slipped through the gates under cover of night, and the massacre that followed cemented his reputation as a warlord of terrifying brilliance. Among the tribes, Agnar's name was spoken with reverence. Among the Romans, it was uttered in fear. Whispers reached even the heart of Rome, painting him as a phantom who commanded the wolves of the forest, a man who could move armies without leaving a trace. Children were frightened into obedience with tales of the wolf of the north. Yet Agnar was not blinded by superstition. He understood the power of myth and wielded it like a weapon. He allowed his warriors to spread rumors that he could speak with spirits, that no blade could pierce his skin, and that the gods themselves guided his hand in battle. These stories, exaggerated and multiplied, demoralized his enemies before a single arrow was loosed. In the north, Agnar's stronghold rose like a dark crown upon a frozen cliff, a fortress carved from black stone, hidden deep within the mountains. Fires burned in its watchtowers, casting eerie glows across the snowy peaks. Here Agnar held council with his war chiefs, planning raids that struck deep into Roman territory. He had no interest in pitched battles against Rome's disciplined legions. Instead, he sought to bleed them dry, to humiliate them until the empire's aura of invincibility crumbled. Maps covered the wooden tables of his council chamber, marked not with neat Roman measurements, but with tribal symbols, rivers, valleys, and ancient paths known only to hunters and herders. Agnar's mind was as sharp as any Roman tactician's, and he exploited every weakness he could find. He sent spies to stir rebellion among Rome's allies. He orchestrated ambushes along trade routes, starving Roman garrisons of supplies. He even ordered false trails to be left in the forests, luring Roman patrols into deadly traps. But perhaps his most dangerous weapon was psychological warfare. Agnar understood fear better than any general in Rome. After Vallis Nox, he ordered the corpses of slain Romans displayed on pikes at the city gates, their armor left to freeze and glisten in the snow like statues. Survivors were deliberately spared and sent back to Roman territory with tales of horrors that would chill even veteran soldiers. His goal was not merely victory but domination of the Roman psyche. And yet, for all his ruthlessness, Agnar was not without a code. He treated his warriors with respect, rewarding loyalty with land and honor. Among the tribes, he was seen not just as a warlord but as a father figure, a man who understood their grievances and fought for their freedom. Even those who feared him followed him with unwavering devotion. Agnar's rise was not without challenge. Some tribal chieftains balked at the idea of submitting to a single ruler. But Agnar was as skilled in diplomacy as he was in war. He settled disputes with cunning, using gifts and marriages to secure alliances. When persuasion failed, he resorted to displays of strength, challenging rivals to duels and defeating them in brutal combat. By the winter of 18 AD, Agnar had forged an alliance that stretched across the northern frontier, a coalition that rivaled the strength of Rome itself. To the Romans, Agnar was a barbarian, a savage warlord. But those who had met him face to face spoke of his intelligence, his piercing blue eyes that seemed to see into a man's soul, and his uncanny ability to anticipate his enemies' moves. He was a strategist cloaked in wolfskins, a king in all but name. From his mountain fortress, Agnar watched Rome with cold calculation. He knew the empire was vast, its armies formidable, but he also knew that its strength was stretched thin. Rebellions simmered in far-off provinces. Politics rotted its senate from within. Rome's arrogance had left it blind to the threat rising in the north. Agnar would exploit that blindness until Rome knelt. As the winter deepened, Agnar prepared for his next move. He sent his war bands to harry Roman outposts, capturing supplies and spreading terror. He ordered scouts to map every Roman fort along the frontier, and he began whispering his ultimate vision to his closest lieutenants, not merely to repel Rome, but to bring the empire itself to its knees. But Agnar had underestimated one thing: the iron will of a man who had survived Vallis Nox. Even as he plotted his next strike, Flavius Cassian was gathering a force unlike any Rome had ever seen, a legion of shadows forged in fire and vengeance. And for the first time in his life, the wolf of the north would soon discover what it meant to be hunted. The halls of Rome buzzed with anger and fear, but far from the marble splendor of the capital, in a fortress carved into the snowy cliffs of the frontier, Flavius Cassian worked in silence. He had been granted authority to raise a new force, but this would not be a traditional legion of gleaming armor and marching formations. The Iron Hawk envisioned something far more dangerous, a brotherhood forged not for parades but for vengeance. He began by sending out a summons, not through the Senate's decrees, but through whispers in taverns, messages carried on secret roads and letters written in his own hand. He called not for men of rank or reputation, but for those with nothing left to lose. Soldiers who had seen their comrades slaughtered, hunters who had lost families to northern raids, exiles who craved redemption. All were welcome, so long as they were willing to bleed for Rome. The men came in twos and threes, traveling through mountain passes and frozen rivers to reach Cassian's fortress. Among them were grizzled veterans, scarred gladiators, and scouts who knew the northern forest better than any Roman officer. They came because of Cassian's name, whispered now as a promise of vengeance. By the end of winter, he had gathered 500 men, a far cry from a full legion, but each man burned with purpose. Cassian transformed the fortress into a crucible. Training began at dawn and did not end until the stars lit the sky. Gone were the rigid drills of the Roman legions. This was training for shadow war. The recruits learned to move silently in the snow, to navigate forests without leaving a trace, and to fight in the dark. They practiced ambushes, disguises, and sabotage. Cassian taught them to strike quickly and vanish before the enemy could react. Most crucially, he changed their appearance. Instead of the bright armor of Roman soldiers, they wore dark, reinforced leather in chainmail, light enough for speed but strong enough to deflect a blade. Each man carried a mask, a black, expressionless visage that covered their faces entirely. When they marched together in silence, they looked less like men and more like phantoms. The tribes would come to fear them as the Ghosts of Vallis. Cassian himself was relentless. Though his wound from Vallis Nox had never fully healed, he trained alongside his men, his gray eyes unyielding. He was a soldier first, a commander second, and a legend in the making. He insisted on discipline, but unlike other Roman officers, he fought shoulder to shoulder with his recruits, earning their loyalty not through rank but through shared suffering. His leadership transformed these outcasts into a brotherhood, a single blade honed to a razor's edge. The Ghosts of Vallis struck for the first time in early spring. Under the cover of night, they descended upon a northern supply caravan bound for Agnar's stronghold. The raiders never saw them coming. Silent figures emerged from the mist, striking with deadly precision. Not a single Roman was lost, and the enemy caravan burned before dawn. Word spread quickly among the tribes. The Romans had birthed a force of demons who hunted in the darkness. These early victories were only the beginning. Cassian's strategies were revolutionary for Rome. Instead of engaging in pitched battles, he used fear and unpredictability to weaken Agnar's hold over the tribes. His ghosts sabotaged enemy forges, burned food stores, and ambushed patrols, vanishing into the wilderness before reinforcements could arrive. At every turn, he made Agnar's warriors feel hunted, turning the wolf of the North's tactics against him. As weeks turned into months, the ghosts became more than a fighting force. They became a legend. Tribesmen whispered that the spirits of the 10,000 slain at Vallis Nox had risen to avenge themselves. Campfires were extinguished early, and warriors refused to travel at night, fearing the blank-eyed masks that glimmered in the moonlight. Agnar's aura of invincibility began to crack, not through brute force, but through terror. Yet Cassian was not content with fear alone. He understood that Agnar's power lay in unity. To shatter it, he turned to politics. He sent spies to spread false rumors of betrayal among the tribes, carefully planting seeds of distrust. He bribed certain chieftains, offering them Roman gold and safe passage in exchange for their loyalty. Others were coerced through displays of power. Captured warriors were released with haunting messages. The Iron Hawk knows your name. Slowly, Agnar's coalition began to fracture. Minor tribes withdrew their warriors from his ranks, fearful of Roman retribution. Others hesitated to march, doubting Agnar's ability to protect them. For every alliance Agnar forged, Cassian tore two apart. It was a silent war of knives in the dark, and Cassian wielded the sharpest blade. Within his fortress, Cassian was both a general and a father to his ghosts. He knew every man by name, listened to their stories, and honored their losses. He understood that these men were not merely soldiers. They were weapons sharpened by grief. Under his guidance, they became brothers, bound by a singular purpose, to avenge Vallis Nox. One evening, as Cassian stood on the battlements overlooking the snowy valleys, his closest advisor, Marcus Varro, approached. Varro, a veteran centurion who had served Rome for 3 decades, spoke with quiet reverence. "You've created something new," Varro said. "Not an army, but a myth." Cassian's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. A myth is what Agnar used to build his power. Now it will destroy him. Varro hesitated. "And when Vallis Nox burns? What then?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "Then Rome will know that vengeance can be a weapon, and perhaps the tribes will learn that betrayal has a cost no man can pay." As summer approached, Cassian's preparations neared completion. Through captured scouts, he learned that Agnar planned to host a great council in Vallis Nox, gathering the leaders of all allied tribes. It was an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Strike once, and he could decapitate the entire coalition. Plans were drawn, maps marked, and every ghost prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. They would infiltrate Vallis Nox under the same pale moon that had witnessed their massacre. This time, however, Rome would be the predator. Cassian's transformation was complete. The haunted young general who had fled Vallis Nox now stood as a commander who bent fear itself to his will. His men followed him not because of his title, but because they believed he carried the wrath of every Roman slain that night. Even the emperor, watching from afar, began to realize that Cassian was not merely a soldier. He was a force of nature. The wolf of the north had awakened a storm, and that storm now gathered at his gates. The moon hung low over Vallis Nox, just as it had on that cursed night months ago. The streets, once slick with Roman blood, now bustled with the war drums of the northern tribes. Bonfires lit the town square, their flames licking the dark sky as warriors from a dozen clans feasted and drank. At the heart of the city stood the great hall, where Agnar the Wolf of the North sat upon a chair of carved antlers, his eyes glowing like embers. He was at the height of his power. Every chieftain who mattered was under his roof. But outside the gates, Cassian and the Ghosts of Vallis watched from the tree line, their black masks glinting faintly in the torchlight. 500 men, clad in shadows, moved with the precision of predators. No banners, no trumpets. No sound of armor clinking, only the whisper of steel and the steady breaths of those about to avenge the dead. Cassian crouched behind a boulder, his eyes fixed on the city walls. "Remember," he whispered, his voice calm but sharp. "We strike like ghosts. No mercy, no hesitation. Tonight, Vallis Nox dies." A signal arrow streaked into the sky, its head bursting into a faint green glow. The attack began. The ghosts slipped through the snow like a tide of shadows. Rope ladders flew up against the walls, and within minutes, silent figures were scaling the battlements. Guards were dispatched with swift, soundless strikes, throats slit, bodies eased gently to the ground. Torches were snuffed out one by one, plunging sections of the wall into darkness. Then, like lightning cracking through the stillness, the first explosion shook the night. A section of the outer gate erupted in flames, sending splinters of wood raining over the startled tribesmen. Chaos erupted as warriors scrambled to grab weapons, only to find death already among them. Ghosts surged through the breach, blades flashing in the firelight, striking with surgical precision. Inside the city, pandemonium reigned. The tribes had come expecting celebration, not war. Campfires became beacons for arrows. Warriors stumbled in drunken confusion, only to be dragged into alleys where silent blades awaited. Panic spread like wildfire as the ghosts split into squads, each targeting key locations: the armory, the stables, and the watchtowers. Within minutes, the organized might of Agnar's coalition dissolved into screams and smoke. But the true storm was still to come. Cassian himself led the assault on the Great Hall. His men cleared a path through the streets, their formation tight and lethal. By the time they reached the towering wooden doors, blood pooled beneath their boots, and the cries of dying warriors echoed through the square. Cassian signaled to his demolition crew. Moments later, the massive doors splintered inward under the force of an explosive charge, and the ghost poured into the hall like an avalanche. Agnar stood at the far end, his towering frame illuminated by firelight. He roared, his voice shaking the rafters, and grabbed his great axe. "Come then, Romans," he bellowed. "Come taste death." The hall erupted into a whirlwind of steel and fury. Agnar's personal guard, towering warriors clad in wolf pelts, met the ghosts head-on. The clash was brutal. Steel rang against steel, and blood splattered the wooden walls. Cassian fought at the front, his sword a blur of motion. His mask reflected the flickering firelight, making him look like a specter risen from the grave. Agnar cut through men like a scythe through wheat, his axe splitting shields and bone alike. But Cassian pressed forward, his every strike fueled by the memory of Vallis Nox, of the 10,000 Romans who had died in this very place. Finally, the two leaders clashed in a storm of steel. Agnar swung his axe in a deadly arc, but Cassian ducked beneath it, driving his blade into the warlord's side. Agnar roared in pain and slammed a fist into Cassian's chest, knocking him back. But the Iron Hawk rose again, relentless. Their duel was savage, primal, a battle not of armies but of wills. The ghosts tightened their circle, cutting down Agnar's guards one by one. Flames spread across the hall as torches were knocked to the ground. Smoke thickened, choking the air. Cassian feinted left, then lunged forward, plunging his sword deep into Agnar's chest. The warlord staggered, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "For Rome!" Cassian whispered, twisting the blade. Agnar collapsed, his massive body shaking the floorboards as he fell. A hush swept over the hall. The wolf of the north was dead. Outside, the tribes broke, leaderless, terrified, and hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor understand. They fled into the night. Vallis Nox burned behind them, the flames illuminating the masked figures who moved through the city like phantoms, finishing their grim work. By dawn, the once proud stronghold was reduced to ash and ruin. The bodies of chieftains and warriors littered the square where Roman soldiers had been butchered months before. The ghosts of Vallis had avenged their brothers, and their legend was sealed in blood. Cassian stood atop the city gates as the sun rose over the smoking ruins. He removed his mask, his face pale but resolute. Around him, his men knelt, their masks still on, their weapons stained crimson. "Rome lives," Cassian declared, his voice carrying over the silent battlefield. "And Vallis Nox is no more." The ghosts let out a cry, a sound so fierce, so primal, that it echoed through the valleys for miles. It was not just a victory, it was a warning. News of the massacre spread faster than fire through dry grass. The northern tribes, terrified by the fate of their champions, abandoned their war efforts. Rome's enemies now whispered of Cassian not as a man, but as a specter, a weapon of vengeance sent by the gods themselves. Back in Rome, the Senate hailed him as a savior. Songs were sung of the ghosts of Vallis, their black masks becoming symbols of fear and respect. Yet Cassian himself remained unchanged. He walked among his men, honoring the fallen, his eyes always fixed northward, as if expecting another storm. For though Vallis Nox was gone, he knew Rome's peace was only borrowed. And when war came again, he would be ready, because Cassian had become more than a general. He had become Rome's vengeance incarnate.